Tansa toya kakeo, kinanaskom tanawa ota pientumiak. Tansa toya ketea kogimagan kakeo. I'm so pleased to be here with you today. I give my greetings to all of the elders and leaders and everyone here in this room. My thanks to the Yellowknives Dene Nation for welcoming me to this territory. Thank you, Chief Sangris. My thanks also for the opening prayer song, and which I felt was so powerful and a wonderful way to begin this gathering. And I wanted to thank also Dr. Kelly for your welcoming words from the government. And my very special thanks to the team of people, including my friend Lilith, Brooke, who, amongst many others, worked so hard to help me to be here with you today and brought all of us together. I think this is a perfect moment for this gathering. It's an ideal time for us to speak together about inspiration and connection and partnerships and collaboration. We are in a moment when reconciliation is being deeply questioned across Canada right now. There's a lot happening. And in this moment, I think our continued efforts to co-create an ethical space for Indigenous leadership in conservation and biodiversity is needed more than ever. I can only speak for myself that in all of the tumult of difficult challenges around climate change, debates over economies and power, and seeing laws being twisted and frayed, when I see events happen and words being spoken that make me question the good of people in general, this work that we're here to do together is work that gives me hope. It's a critical moment for Mother Earth as well. A lot of leading scientists working in large bodies like at the United Nations have shown that biodiversity loss, climate change impacts, and land degradation are deeply interconnected and are taking place at an unprecedented level. Extinction rates are frightening. There are reports that 75% of the Earth's land surface is significantly altered. 66% of ocean area is experiencing cumulative impacts, and over 85% of wetlands worldwide have been lost. The saving grace is that we have, working collaboratively and in partnership, the evidence, knowledge, and ability to address those things on a scale that no one ever really imagined even a few years ago. Our successes in conservation and protection will generate multiple benefits for the well-being of everybody and Mother Earth. The widespread support that I've seen for the concept and formation of Indigenous protected and conserved areas has animated and energized an awakening of the public to the possibilities, the potential represented by IPCA's, Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas, and how Indigenous leadership can be a catalyst to profound advancements in protection of lands, waters, and all those who live upon Mother Earth. In particular, over the last couple of years, there have been some major accomplishments, which of course we'll discuss together over the next few days. And in preparing for this gathering, I thought, why have some of these efforts sort of borne such rich fruit? What is it about the area of conservation, protected areas, biodiversity, and Indigenous peoples that creates such magic in the face of hard challenges and difficulties that I talked about? So in thinking about this question, I remembered the first meeting I ever attended regarding the Convention on Biodiversity. And I started to really think deeply about the roles of Indigenous peoples in conservation and biodiversity. And that first meeting was in 2004. That was well before the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples had ever been passed by the UN General Assembly. It was before we had ever even really uttered the word reconciliation. It was a time when many First Nations were deep in negotiations, litigation of rights and identity, and struggle within a legal and political landscape that tended to exclude, diminish, and obscure those rights and identities. And yet, in 2004, when I went to this meeting on the Convention on Biodiversity, the CBD, Indigenous peoples at that time, in the context of that convention, were already being thought of as leaders. Their knowledge systems, our knowledge systems, were already being recognized with efforts to empower those systems and elevate them to the appropriate level of recognition and respect. And I remember being at this meeting and being in total shock and awe at the tone of the dialogue at the meeting. It was unlike any other that I had participated in at the UN regarding environment and rights of Indigenous peoples in general. So why was this? Well, to start with, in the context of international law, the Convention on Biodiversity, which was written and ratified in 1992, is the only international treaty of all international treaties that right from the start, right when it was drafted, established a formal body of Indigenous peoples who would tell the parties to the treaty, including Canada, how to consider their knowledge and respect their leadership in their own territories. And that was under Article HA of that convention. It was called the HA Working Group. That structure within that treaty was entirely unique in international law, a precursor to all those more contemporary developments that elevated Indigenous recognition. So when I thought about that, it really made a lot of sense to me when I was invited to serve on the Indigenous Circle of Experts for the Pathway to Canada Target 1 initiative. Being part of the work to implement targets set in the context of the CBD meant that I could be part of a movement that was light years beyond any progress we made in so many other areas. So what were the targets that were being discussed under that initiative? They were called the Aichi targets. And their name came from a city in Japan where the meeting was held to set the targets. There were 20 Aichi targets, which were set in 2010, and which everyone decided they wanted to accomplish by this year, 2020, and Canada was in that group. Canada decided to take a few of the targets and make them a priority nationally, including Aichi Target 11, which was to increase protected and conserved areas to 17% of total land and inland waters by this year. At the time the work commenced in Canada, only around 10% was protected. So how was success going to be measured? So when the CBD talked about setting these targets and worked with all these countries to try to implement these Aichi targets by this year, the UN said they would measure success of countries by looking at different actions and milestones, including countries who recognized Indigenous conserved areas through acknowledgement in legislation, congratulations, or other effective means, formal inclusion in the national systems, and practicing of various governance types. And so I think this concept of legislation is incredibly important and something that we mentioned in the We Rise Together report. And I think we've reached that milestone in a lot of different ways, and I wanted to touch on some of the recommendations that came out of the ICE report, We Rise Together. So ICE recommended that federal and provincial governments endorse the concept of IPCAs, work with Indigenous governments to support the development and implementation of IPCAs, recognizing how they have the potential to contribute to sustainable, conservation-based Indigenous economies that help diversify other local economies. ICE asked that collaborative management be developed and that support be expressed for Indigenous designed and led programs based in Indigenous laws and stewardship practices. And I think there's a lot of evidence in this gathering over the next few days that these recommendations have life. I'm really excited to think about how here in the Northwest Territories, there is such a strong forward-facing vision of what's possible beyond the targets we set for ourselves nationally and internationally. And actually today, on the other side of the world in Rome, Italy, is a meeting about the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. So what happens after we quote-unquote accomplish these Aichi targets this year? Canada, other governments, and there's quite a few Indigenous peoples who are in Rome today to talk about what the future should hold, what our collective international strategy should be moving forward. So internationally, the proposal for how we move forward is being described as a, quote, theory of change, unquote, approach by the folks who are meeting in Rome today. They foresee a moment of transformation. And I think we're in the same moment in this really special, sacred place in the world. here together to talk about what is possible, what has been accomplished, and to co-create this vision of how we move forward together. I feel that some of the other 28 recommendations that the ICE report summarizes might be helpful, including employing ethical space in our relationship building, making room for Indigenous systems to truly occupy a space of respect for the expertise, deep knowledge, and position of impact of those systems. And I think that is what is different in this moment. That's what's possible in this moment. I think for many, many years now, even the approach under the CBD, under that formal mechanism for Indigenous peoples that was established in 1992, for many years, it sort of took the approach that Indigenous knowledge was a source of information or a data point in a report, as opposed to being entire systems that functioned with integrity. And I think we're in this, I think to me the transformation part of this moment is when Indigenous systems themselves and Indigenous peoples as experts of themselves can speak in full voice and with the same platform as everyone else. I think that is a theory of change approach. And I really sincerely believe that all of these diverse Indigenous systems are fundamental, are vital for all living beings in Mother Earth, to transform our roles, our responsibilities, and our impact with each other and with all life. And I just want to congratulate everybody here for gathering together to share with one another. And it's such a wonderful indicator that you've chosen to make this an annual event, because I think it can only strengthen things moving forward. I would very much encourage you to consider using this annual event to assess your progress, to co-develop indicators of success that are not the usual sort of suspect indicators, the kind of indicators that we're used to seeing to measure biodiversity conservation or protection. Let's co-create some really innovative, amazing new indicators that reflect what collaboration should really look like and what is possible. Hi, thank you very much.
All right, are there any questions for Danika? Might have to stand up so we can see you and bring you a microphone. Sorry, where? Oh. I'm not sure who you were pointing to, Tanya? Oh, yeah, but we do have someone to rove around. Any questions for Danika right now? There, great.
Do you have any indicators that you've been using that are not the usual suspects?
Right. So actually, that is actually in high demand internationally right now. The only indicator set that I know of that was ever co-developed between Indigenous peoples and a mainstream institution in this particular area was developed by the Food and Agriculture Organization and International Indian Treaty Council about maybe 15 years ago. And they were a set of cultural indicators on food sovereignty, actually. But they had, because Indigenous peoples in general, I would say it's an easy thing to say that our approaches are quite focused on like interconnection and that kind of thing, that the indicators themselves try to speak to taking an Indigenous lens and stepping slightly away from a highly specific focus on a science-based approach. And so trying to create new connections between what an Indigenous lens, how that can be articulated, how it can be described in the context of indicator development, and then trying to connect that with science. And so I can definitely send you that to look at, but as far as I know, that's the only set of indicators. And unfortunately, unfortunately so, because we also have other initiatives that impact the work that you guys are doing. So things like the Sustainable Development Goals, which talk a lot about so what does a sustainable economy look like? How should we deal with climate change? What role does culture have to play? There's a lot of sort of controversial conversations happening at the UN around that. There's also, of course, all the work that's happening on climate and climate change, adaptation and mitigation, and there's a lot of controversy around how do we measure our success in being able to adapt and mitigate impacts of climate, and what should our approach be in that regard. And so I think in that context, it's even more important to treat Indigenous systems less like a backup plan or an afterthought or something that is sort of a corollary to the main substance, but rather bring Indigenous systems into something that actually is elevated and allows for those indicators to be expressed by those systems themselves. And so while the FAO IITC cultural indicators on food sovereignty are somewhat useful, they're also incredibly general and incredibly broad because they were intended to try to apply to a lot of different Indigenous peoples in different regions of the world at the same time. And so what I would suggest is to have geographically specific indicator development initiatives happening where you would have scientists and people in government working collaboratively with Indigenous peoples from those places and spaces to co-develop or co-lead development of indicators that are actually relevant to those places, as opposed to something that's being imported in from a place that has no resonance for that geographical area. So, and there's so many different levels as well, right? It's not just about sort of a technical approach. And I think that's the other part of trying to make room for Indigenous systems is that so often we're asked to just try to restrain ourselves and constrain ourselves in the box of what could be called technical advice. And it's really hard for Indigenous systems to fully express themselves if they're not allowed to express things around spirituality, around language, around culture, around, family, and a whole bunch of other ways of being that a purely scientific approach has sort of quite conscientiously excluded from process, right? And so I think that's the challenge is how do we help people to make the space to step aside? It's not that they have to understand the system that they're stepping aside for, but it's that they just have to be willing to make the room for those systems to actually be elevated and have the space to speak for themselves.
Any other questions for Danika? We have time for another question.
It's early. It's
They'll be peppering you with questions at the break. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's give a round of applause. Oh, we do have one. There we go. Claudia, could you hand the mic? Spoke too soon. Sorry.
Good morning. Could you expand on the you made reference to 8J? Mm-hmm. Can you expand on it, please? Thank you.
And I can definitely give you some information later. But so in 1992, a lot of the environmental treaties that exist internationally were written at that time. So there was a treaty on desertification. There was a CBD. That was also when they wrote the treaty on climate change, the UNFCCC. So all of these things sort of happened around 92. And so it was really unique to that treaty, the CBD, that Article 8J referenced Indigenous peoples, first of all. But at that time, of course, we weren't called peoples at the UN. We were considered groups, we were considered communities, but we were not considered peoples. We weren't considered peoples at the UN until 2007, when the UN passed the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I would argue that the UN didn't really consider us full human beings until 2007, but that's a whole other conversation. So when the CBD established Article 8J Working Group, it was definitely totally anomalous. Like, it was the only situation in the whole UN infrastructure where there was a formal body dedicated to convening Indigenous people to talk about what they then called traditional knowledge, which we're all sort of used to hearing about. They then called traditional knowledge and biodiversity and protection. And so in all the years that this working group has existed, a lot, like probably hundreds of different Indigenous representatives from all regions of the world have attended and participated in the meetings. The AJ working group meets regularly. I think it's biannually. They provide advice to the Conference of the Parties of the CBD. So what the Conference of the Parties means is that the treaty, the Convention on Biological Diversity, every party to that treaty, so every country that signs and ratifies that treaty, which includes Canada, is considered a party. When they have a Conference of the Parties, it's basically just a meeting of all the parties to the treaty that happens annually, I believe. And they make decisions about what's going to happen next in terms of the implementation of that treaty internationally as well as sort of intergovernmentally. And so the HA working group provides advice to the Conference of the Parties as well as the Secretariat of the Convention on Biodiversity. And so it's an incredibly important body. It's also been a huge source of controversy because, of course, when it was convened in 1992, I mean, you know, we were only allowed to set foot on the grounds of the UN in 1977. We, as Indigenous peoples, we weren't even allowed to go into the grounds of the UN. Many leaders tried to go to UN meetings to make an argument for them as Indigenous peoples, as nations, and they were turned down and barred out from the grounds of the UN. It wasn't until 77 that we were allowed in. And so from 77 to 92, we had sort of like this gradual negotiated place within the UN system as Indigenous peoples that we were starting to engage in, which ultimately led to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So in 1992, when the CBD established the HA Working Group, at that time, we were still not considered peoples. A lot of countries didn't even recognize that they had Indigenous peoples in their countries, and some still don't. So there was a lot of controversy around that. So people from countries where they weren't recognized were trying to go to the HA meetings and they wouldn't be allowed because they weren't recognized as Indigenous. There were a lot of controversial issues that came before the HA Working Group around how do you even define traditional knowledge in the context of international law? How should that be implemented? What's the role of countries? What's the role of the treaty and the secretariat to the treaty? What's the role of the UN, and in general? And one of the biggest controversies for a long time, more recently, was that after the UN Declaration was passed in 2007. A lot of the states, the member states to the UN, so countries like Canada, France, UK, etc., they sort of tried to diminish the impact that the declaration might have on international law by insisting that the phrases that were used in the context of legally binding agreements like treaties, so like the CBD or the UNFCCC or what have you, that they continue to use the phrase Indigenous and local communities, or Indigenous peoples and local communities. And what that does is it sort of diminishes the impact of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, because the title of the declaration is not Indigenous peoples and local communities, it's just Indigenous peoples. But the local communities part is sort of a workaround that some states have used to sort of get out of the position of having to recognize that there are Indigenous peoples who are in fact rights holders. And so that's sort of like a controversy that's been sort of ongoing, even within the CBD itself. So CBD continues to say Indigenous peoples and local communities, even though it continues to be fought against by many Indigenous representatives who go. But the whole issue of Indigenous representation at the UN is also a huge can of worms, because obviously the UN is created by and for states, right? And so that's another thing we have to sort of take with a grain of salt, is that when we talk about the UN and the standards that they have set out, we also have to remember that it's not like an independent arbiter of human rights standards or standards in general. These are standards that are set by and for states, state parties like Canada, like the UK, like France. And I've been in many meetings where it's been incredibly challenging to be an Indigenous person in that room, because it's very obvious that I'm obstructing their progress because I'm trying to advocate for true Indigenous identity and presence and voice, and that they're not interested in that a lot of the time. So the AJ working group is hugely important, and a lot of it's seen as like a really important foothold for a lot of Indigenous advocates, because it's a formalized mechanism. Since that happened, it's like everybody got really gun shy and didn't want to put anything formal in, because they saw the power that the AJ working group had over the Conference of the Parties for the CBD. So really, like, the work under the CBD has, like I said in my talk, has been sort of light years ahead of many other areas, because there was a formalized mechanism, because they had a way of binding states to listen to what they had to say, because it was part of the treaty. It was in the text of the treaty. We are not in the text of really any other treaty for environment, besides like small, tiny references in preambles. So the fact that we're an operative text, meaning like the actual articles of the treaty in the CBD, really matters. And it really matters the kind of language that's used moving forward. Like, what's the phrasing that's used? How do we go about describing relationships or who we are vis-a-vis those standard-setting processes? I think that's really important.
Okay, thanks very much, Danika. Could we get some applause for Danika?